Jesus is determined to go to Jerusalem. His journey to the holy city had begun long ago at the very end of chapter 9. Now we're in chapter 19. 3 times Jesus has told his disciples exactly what would happen once he got to the city. He speaks about himself in third person. The Son of Man will be handed over to the Gentiles. He will be mocked, insulted, spat upon, and flogged. They will kill him, and on the 3rd day he will rise again. But the disciples understood nothing Jesus said. Jesus is intent on reaching the city, but there will be 2 interruptions before he gets there. The first interruption is a voice. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. It was the voice of Bartimaeus, a blind beggar crying out from his place beside the road. He cried out louder, even though people told him to shut up. Jesus stops and calls to him. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked the blind man. "Lord, let me see again." Could the man be speaking not only for himself, but for the disciples who still didn't see anything Jesus was talking about? Could the man be speaking also for us? "Receive your sight," Jesus said, and it was so. Then Jesus went on, going as far as Jericho, and he planned to pass through. But there will be another interruption. There was a man who lived in Jericho named Zacchaeus. We don't know too much about him except that he was a chief tax collector and he was short in stature. I don't know if he thought much about being short, but it makes for a good story. It was one of my favorite stories in Sunday school. Our teacher stuck the little cloth man onto the flannel board and then helped him climb up the tree and out on a branch, waiting for Jesus to come by. We sat on our miniature Sunday school chairs and sang, "Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he." Or maybe you never saw a flannel board and you never sang that song. Maybe being short didn't bother Zacchaeus. He lived long before anybody played basketball. And from archaeological evidence, it appears that people were shorter in those days. I think he probably thought more about being a chief tax collector. Did he grow up dreaming of becoming a tax collector? Children probably didn't dream about such things. Your father was a farmer, you became a farmer. Your father was a carpenter, you would be a carpenter, and your mother would probably be working at home. Who would want to be a chief tax collector? It wasn't just that collecting taxes was unpleasant, but it was being part of the Roman system. Zacchaeus was an agent of the state, a Jewish man who had turned oppressor of his own people. Somebody has to collect taxes, he told himself. If I don't do it, somebody else will. If I quit, it won't make taxes go away. He still had that same conversation with himself almost every morning. At least he was well off, rich, according to the story. Short of stature, but rich. Some days it was almost enough, but not every day. So he tried to list the positives. I'm a good supporter. My family has a roof over their head and food on the table, and I don't have to beg in the streets. He knew people despised him because of his work, but he also knew more than a few who would take his place if they had the chance. Work, even unpleasant work, is better than no work. So it was, one day upon another, upon another, upon another. He longed for something more. He didn't talk about it much, but he knew that making a living wasn't the same as making a life. Then one day, one ordinary day, he heard shouting in the street, "Jesus of Nazareth is here in Jericho." Zacchaeus had heard of this prophet, though he usually tried to avoid crowds. He wanted to see Jesus, because one day on the street, he had overheard somebody say, "Jesus of Nazareth? Yeah, I've heard of him, but I wouldn't go near him. He's a friend of tax collectors and sinners." What if that was true? Zacchaeus pushed through the crowd, but people were already standing 3 deep along the road. No way he could get through. And then he saw the sycamore tree. He had always been good at climbing. It had been his way of feeling tall as a child. He didn't care who stared or pointed or laughed. He hooked his legs around the bottom branch and hoisted himself up. He felt like he could see the whole world, and he could surely see the man everybody was talking about. He felt like he could see all the way to Jerusalem. Later, he'd go home and tell his family, "I saw Jesus today, you know, the man everyone's talking about. He was so close, I could have touched him." Just then, Jesus stopped and looked up. It was probably a second. It could have been a lifetime. "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." Some things you can never explain. Zacchaeus couldn't explain why he climbed up in the tree or why he got down, and he had no idea how Jesus knew his name. But that day changed his life in radical ways. There was something about Jesus, something in the way he seemed to know what you were thinking or wondering about. Zacchaeus could hardly believe the words that came out of his mouth. He promised to give half of his possessions to the poor and to pay back 4-fold anyone he had defrauded. Jesus heard the complaints from some in the crowd. "Look, he's going to be the guest of a sinner." Zacchaeus was smiling a bit because he thought, maybe that's the same man I overheard on the street, the man who called Jesus a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Jesus turned to the crowd and said, "Today salvation has come to this house, for he too is a son of Abraham." Just a few chapters ago, Jesus had healed a bent-over woman in the synagogue. When the religious leaders protested because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, he told them, "Ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" A daughter of Abraham. Nobody had ever called her that before. I guess that means that she and Zacchaeus are now related. We don't know if Zacchaeus left his job, but if he stayed, he would surely have changed his business practices. Jesus had set his face toward Jerusalem 10 chapters ago. He didn't plan to stop until he got there. But while passing through Jericho, he saw a short tax collector up in a tree. He stopped. He looked up. Then he called Zacchaeus to come down. Jesus found him that day, and Zacchaeus found that life was more than making a living. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. That's not a promise postponed until we die. It's a promise now to those who have lost jobs and those who no longer find meaning in their work, those who will change careers many times, and those who feel so angry they have to blame immigrants for taking the jobs nobody here wanted in the first place. Jesus stops today to meet us wherever we are, proud of our successes or ashamed of our failures. Something inside us knows that making a living is not the same as finding your life. "Come down," says Jesus. I have a surprise for you.